You are standing in the middle of a bustling courtyard in Thebes. The air is dry, thick with powdered sand that seems to cling to every exposed surface. It is the 18th dynasty, and the sun does not simply shine, it sears. The wind, when it comes, carries more grit than relief. It is not a place that invites comfort, and yet comfort, or more accurately, control over discomfort, was a high art form in this ancient land. Grooming was not vanity. Grooming was order, and for the ancient Egyptians, order was divine. Let us begin not with royalty, but with an upper-middle-class official, perhaps a temple accountant. He is not rich enough for a palace, but certainly not so low as to bathe in the river like the peasants. He wakes before dawn, before breakfast, before prayer. He reaches for a small jar, well-worn, alabaster, and smooth from years of daily use. It holds scented oil, most likely made of moringa or castor, sometimes mixed with crushed myrrh or cinnamon bark. With practiced calm, he rubs a few drops over his scalp, face, and neck. He is bald, by design. Almost everyone in Egypt, man, woman, or child, shaved their heads. Hair to the Egyptians was a liability. It trapped lice, it retained heat, and it interfered with hygiene rituals. Priests shaved their entire bodies every 3 days. Officials and nobles shaved frequently enough to remain hairless in appearance. They used razors made of sharpened copper, sometimes bronze. The blade was broad and flat, requiring a steady hand, and most likely help from another. Shaving was not a solo endeavor. It was a social act, part personal care, part ritual cleansing. You may be wondering, without mirrors, how did they manage such detail? Well, mirrors did exist. Polished copper or bronze discs, fitted with handles, reflect the viewer with a dull, distorted image, useful mostly for grooming and not much else. That, combined with daylight and a helper, allowed for surprisingly precise shaving sessions. But of course, cuts were inevitable. And here, again, the oil returned. Soothing skin, healing abrasions, and masking the ever-present scent of sweat and sand. Body hair was similarly unwelcome. Waxing was known. Sugaring may have been used. Boiling. Down sugar, water, and lemon into a sticky paste, applied and ripped off, much like modern methods. But most often, people relied on sharpened blades and plucking tools. Tweezers made from bronze or copper were found in many tombs, their edges pinched and curved just enough to grab stubborn hairs. The process must have been painstaking, especially considering how many times a week it had to be repeated. Yet no effort was spared, and lice, always lice. Despite their obsession with cleanliness, lice were a daily struggle. Combs were dual-sided, wide teeth on one side to detangle, fine teeth on the other to trap the little invaders. These were not disposable tools. They were carved from wood, often sycamore or tamarisk, and designed to last. Lice combs, preserved. In graves, still hold the fossilized remains of their targets, which is perhaps the most literal evidence we have of the infestation, and the effort to remove it. So where did one do all this grooming? Most houses did not have bathrooms in the modern sense. Water was stored in large pottery jars. Baths were usually conducted sitting on a small stool with a sloped surface, pouring water over oneself while servants assisted with scrubbing. Soap was not common in the way you might imagine. Instead, natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture harvested from dry lake beds, was used to scrub the skin. It was mildly caustic and dried the skin quickly, which is why oiling afterward became essential. This brings us to fragrance. If there is one detail about ancient Egypt that was anything but boring, it's the lengths to which they went to smell better. Perfumed cones were perhaps the most curious example. These were small waxy domes, infused with scented oils and flowers, worn atop wigs or shaved heads during feasts and ceremonies. As the cone slowly melted from body heat, it released its fragrance. Some historians believe the cones were more symbolic than practical, but residues found on skeletons suggest they were indeed used. Smelling good was not a luxury. It was a social requirement, a moral one even, but not all grooming was self-administered. Professional barbers existed, especially in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. These were not the neighborhood hairdressers we think of today. A barber might come to your home or set up shop near a temple. The act of grooming someone else was considered intimate, almost sacred. Tools were kept in small kits, often carried in leather or linen rolls. A good barber was a prized servant or tradesman, trusted, discreet, and skilled in shaving, plucking, oiling, and even light massage. Children, too, followed these routines, though with some variation. Most young boys and girls wore the side lock of youth, a single braid or lock of hair on one side of an otherwise shaven head. It was both a cultural marker and a practical style, easing the transition into adulthood, when total hair removal became expected. The side lock was often elaborately maintained, sometimes perfumed or braided with thread. Girls wore it too, often alongside decorative amulets or beads. It would be easy to say that this obsession with grooming was purely aesthetic. But in ancient Egypt, cleanliness had religious significance. The gods were orderly. The world, to function properly, had to be purified. Dirt and disorder were signs of chaos, and chaos, or Esfet, was the enemy of Ma'at, the sacred concept of balance and harmony. Grooming, then, was not a private indulgence. It was a daily ritual of cosmic significance. And yet, despite all this oiling, shaving, scrubbing, and plucking, the question remains, how did it feel to live this way, constantly aware of your body, your scent, your smoothness, or lack thereof? Was it comforting, exhausting, a source of pride or pressure? More curiously, what did they think of those who refused to conform? Did anyone grow their hair out? Let their beard grow wild? Smell of the Nile instead of myrrh? You return to the heat and hum of Thebes, this time with a closer eye for hierarchy. While grooming may have been a daily ritual for everyone from farmers to pharaohs, the level of detail and the consequences of deviation differed greatly depending on who you were and what roles you played. For the elite, grooming was not merely a matter of cleanliness. It was a visible performance of status, piety, and control. Let us step into the home of a noble woman, perhaps a member of the court, or married to a priest of high rank. Her day begins, in much the same way as our temple accountants, before the sun, before the bustle, in silence and stillness. But the tools available to her are far more elaborate. Her grooming box, a rectangular chest made from cedar imported from Lebanon, is inlaid with ivory and adorned with delicate scenes of lotus blossoms, monkeys, and perhaps even her own cartouche. Within the box are small lidded jars containing creams, oils, and unguents, many imported or prepared by specialist perfumers. Almond oil, if she is fortunate, myrrh, cinnamon, and frankincense, honey, for its softening effects. A chunk of natron sits beside a shallow basin, ready to be ground into a paste. A polished bronze mirror reflects her expression, not clearly, but enough for adjustment. An attendant, a trusted servant, or perhaps a younger relative, applies the first layer of oil to her skin. The noblewoman is likely hairless beneath her long linen dress, which is sheer and clings lightly to the body. Unlike the working classes, she does not expose herself to the dust and grime of manual labor. But the grooming must still be thorough. Her scalp is shaved, or she wears a tightly bound braid of her own hair under a heavy wig. These wigs were not simple affairs. They were masterfully made, often from human hair, fixed with beeswax and perfumed. Some were stiff with resin to hold their shape, designed to resemble intricate braids or ringlets, sometimes adorned with gold threads or beads. It is important to note that the wearing of wigs was not exclusive to women. Men wore them too, particularly during ceremonies or social gatherings. The priests, of course, were exceptions. Their heads were always shaven. But officials, scribes, and soldiers at court might don elaborate wigs as part of their formal appearance. The variety of styles was a language of its own. Short wigs suggested modesty or practical work. Longer, layered wigs indicated wealth and refinement. Some even wore 2 layers. A short underwig topped with a heavier decorative piece. Cosmetics were equally important and were applied daily by both genders. Kohl was used to line the eyes, not simply for aesthetic reasons, but for protection. The dark pigment, made from galena, a lead-based mineral, helped reduce glare from the sun and may have had antibacterial properties. Eye makeup was applied with a small stick or spatula carved from wood or ivory. You can imagine the slow, deliberate motion of drawing a line across the lid, repeating it day after day. Rouge made from red ochre was mixed with fat and dabbed on the cheeks. Lips were tinted with similar pigments. A noble woman's face was not merely presented, it was maintained, protected and prepared, as though her appearance itself were a kind of sacred offering. But even these luxuries did not come without effort. Maintaining one's grooming supplies was work. Oils had to be refreshed, containers cleaned, combs deloused, and razors sharpened on stone. Wigs had to be dusted and re-waxed. Many of these tasks were done by skilled workers, servants, or family members. Grooming in elite households was a team effort. But unlike the casual routines of today, these practices were formalized and consistent. Even in death, the body was expected to be groomed. Burial rituals involved shaving the corpse, anointing it with oils, and adorning it with cosmetics. Some mummies bear traces of eyeliner and rouge, even after thousands of years. Inscriptions. On tomb walls depict scenes of hairdressing and ointment application, suggesting that these acts were considered worthy of eternal repetition. Outside the elite sphere, grooming remained important, though the tools and materials were simpler. Clay jars, bone combs, and wooden razors served in place of luxury items. Yet even peasants maintained the routines. A shaved head was not just practical, it was a social expectation. To neglect grooming was to court social suspicion. It was associated with disease, laziness, or moral failing. Even during famines or wars, records suggest that people continued to shave, bathe, and anoint themselves when possible. And for the priests, especially those serving major temples like Karnak or Luxor, grooming reached its most extreme form. Temple priests were not full-time figures in the way we think of modern clergy. Many served for limited periods, rotating in and out of ritual service. But during their time in the temple, they were held to the strictest standards. They bathed several times a day, shaved their entire bodies every other day, and refrained from certain foods. Their bodies were considered vessels for divine presence, and even a single hair was seen as a potential impurity. The tools of temple grooming were part of the temple inventory. Ritual razors, basins, and oils were accounted for like sacred texts or incense. Some records even note thefts of grooming supplies from temple stores, a reminder that even in the realm of the sacred, mundane needs and temptations persisted. Interestingly, grooming could be weaponized in political ways. Foreign dignitaries, who failed to present themselves according to Egyptian standards, were considered unrefined, even barbaric. Cleanliness and grooming were tied to the concept of civilization itself. Egyptian art often depicts enemies, Libyans, Nubians, or Asiatics, with unkempt hair or beards, signifying disorder and danger. To be smooth, fragrant, and ordered was to be part of the Egyptian world. To be hairy and unclean was to live in chaos, and grooming could influence diplomacy. When envoys from foreign lands visited the pharaoh's court, they were sometimes shaved and anointed upon arrival. This wasn't merely hospitality, it was cultural assertion. By grooming the visitor, Egyptians symbolically reasserted their own superiority and the centrality of Ma'at. This idea extended even into mythology. The gods themselves were imagined as well-groomed. Hathor wore perfumed wigs. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, was depicted with clean lines and careful presentation. To approach a deity in prayer or ritual without grooming was considered disrespectful. But despite all this emphasis on grooming, what about aging? What did grooming look like for the elderly, the infirm, or the forgotten? Archaeological evidence suggests that older individuals, especially those outside the elite class, often had worn teeth, arthritic joints, and evidence of malnutrition. Grooming may have become more difficult or inconsistent, yet some older individuals, even those of modest means, were buried with combs, razors, or coal containers, suggesting that grooming remained a valued practice to the end. Did they continue their routines out of habit? Hope? Pride? Or did they, like we sometimes do today, continue because it made them feel human? And then there were those who fell outside every standard. Prisoners, slaves, the impoverished. We know little about their grooming routines, though. References exist to enforced shaving or washing before entering temple service or appearing in court. To be allowed to groom oneself was, in a sense, to have dignity. And perhaps for those denied it, grooming became a quiet rebellion or a lost privilege. Even in this world of oil and ritual, of razors and social boundaries, one question lingers. How much of this grooming was for others, and how much was for themselves? By now, you've wandered the morning rituals of the Nile Valley, paused at the mirror of a noblewoman, watched a priest run a bronze razor across his scalp, and observed how personal care was not just about comfort, but status, control, and spiritual preparation. Now step even further, into the quiet of death, where grooming did not end but simply changed form. The ancient Egyptians lived with death as a constant presence. Not with morbid fixation, but with acceptance and planning. They believed in an afterlife, a place where one's body and spirit would be reunited. But the body had to be ready. It had to be preserved. It had to be groomed for eternity. Mummification, for all its mystery and grandeur, was an elaborate kind of grooming. And at its core, it was a reaffirmation of the belief that cleanliness was divine order, that a well-kept body reflected a well-kept spirit. You might imagine the embalming room as dark and secretive. In truth, it was likely well-lit and busy. It was a workshop, a place of practical procedure and solemn ritual. Embalmers were not priests in the religious sense, but they were respected specialists, and their craft blended chemistry, ritual, and routine. The body would first be washed, cleansed with palm wine and Nile water. Then came the shaving. Just as in life, the dead were often shaved. Some mummies show evidence of complete depilation. No eyebrows, no body hair, no head hair. The purpose was partly practical, less chance for decay, partly symbolic. A clean body was an ordered body. And in the afterlife, order mattered, organs were removed, dried with natron, and stored in canopic jars. The heart was often preserved carefully, believed to be the seat of emotion and judgment. The brain, however, was discarded. It was not considered important. One wonders then whether they believed grooming habits were seated in the heart as well. How one lived, how one appeared, how one honored others and the gods. After desiccation, the body was anointed with oils. These were not chosen at random. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar oil, fragrant substances with both practical, antibacterial, preservative, and symbolic purposes. Even the poorest were anointed with some form of oil, if not imported resins, then local substitutes, palm oil or animal. Fat. The skin was softened, darkened, made supple. The act of rubbing oil onto the skin, a gesture repeated daily in life, was now performed one final time. Cosmetics, too, were applied to some corpses. Kohl was brushed under the eyes, rouge dabbed onto cheeks. Wigs were adjusted, eyebrows sometimes painted on. In some cases, prosthetics were created, wooden toes or fingers, pads inserted into cheeks to preserve facial fullness. Grooming, even in this final stage, was not about vanity. It was about identity. The dead needed to be recognizable to their souls, their families, the gods. Tombs often contained combs, razors, mirrors, and cosmetic jars, objects meant to be used in the afterlife. These items were not symbolic. They were expected to be used. One tomb belonging to a woman named Irtiru included a full array of personal grooming tools, each carved from wood and ivory, some still stained with remnants of pigment. These items were not laid out like museum pieces. They were stored, packed, ready, like a traveler's bag. In wealthier tombs, depictions of grooming scenes appear on the walls. A woman having her hair braided, a servant bringing oil, a man shaving another's face. These were not memories, they were intentions. The deceased was expected to experience these routines forever, as part of their idealized life in the field of reeds, the Egyptian vision of paradise. In some ways, it was a projection of middle-class comfort: clean clothes, shade, flowing water, food, music, and time for personal care. Even in the afterlife, no one wanted to be ungroomed. But grooming was not just a personal or private affair. It had civic implications. Royal tombs and monuments emphasized the pharaoh's body as the ultimate expression of order. His cleanliness, his smooth skin, his perfumed breath, his shaven face, reflected not just his character, but his ability to maintain Mayat, the divine balance of the cosmos. That's why the pharaoh's grooming items were considered sacred. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered almost completely intact, archaeologists found razors, cosmetic vessels, and even a beautifully crafted folding stool believed to be used during grooming. These objects were not decorative. They were worn, used. The young king had prepared his body daily, or had it prepared for him, as part of his kingly duties. And now, in death, they surrounded him again. Quiet, polished, eternal. 1. Of the more curious aspects of Egyptian funerary grooming is the practice of ritual wigs. While wigs were worn in life, in death they often became stiffened with resin and styled to withstand time. Some scholars believe that specific wig styles denoted social role in the afterlife, just as a priest's wig in life was different from that of a musician or scribe. The logic was seamless. If the afterlife mirrored the ideal version of earthly life, then grooming remained one's calling card, a visual biography of rank and identity. We find, too, evidence of scented cones. Odd almond-shaped cones sometimes shown atop the heads of guests at banquets and ceremonies. Once thought to be purely artistic, archaeological digs have revealed these cones were real. Made of fat mixed with fragrance, they were worn on the head and slowly melted in the heat, releasing perfume. Whether they were used in death as well as life remains debated, but it is easy to imagine the intent, fragrance as a veil between the decaying and the divine. But not everyone was afforded these luxuries. The majority of Egyptians could not afford full mummification. Their bodies were dried more simply, sometimes in the desert sands themselves. Still, even among the poor, there is evidence of grooming tools buried alongside the dead: combs, small mirrors, flint razors. This suggests that even if embalming was out of reach, the hope for grooming beyond death remained strong. And while elites used imported oils, the poor made do with local substitutes. Even in impoverished burials, you might find residue of plant-based unguents applied to the body, proof that some ritual of preparation had taken place. Grooming, in other words, was not merely a luxury. It was a necessity for spiritual passage. One cannot help but reflect on the incredible consistency of it all. The morning grooming ritual, repeated thousands of times in life, was mimicked once more in death. But this final grooming, like all the rest, was not about vanity. It was about transformation, because grooming for the Egyptians was a way of aligning oneself with the gods. It was ritualized, yes, but never abstract. To oil the skin was to preserve it. To shave the head was to remove impurity. To apply kohl was to see more clearly. Even something as mundane as cleaning a comb or grinding pigment became sacred when placed in this context. The modern world has perhaps divided grooming from meaning. We tend to see it as utility or habit, or as performance in a cosmetic, surface-level way. But the Egyptians saw no conflict between surface and spirit. What was done to the body shaped the experience of the soul. Grooming in this worldview was a deeply human act, one of continuity, dignity, and preparation. So now, after thousands of years, a quiet question lingers in the museum glass where these objects rest. Did they know that in tending to their bodies, they were writing a kind of history? Did they imagine we would one day reconstruct their mornings, their mirrors, their combs, and more curiously still, what does our own grooming say about us, about what we value, and how we prepare for what comes next? You wake before dawn in a damp timber cottage. Your straw mattress itches, your limbs are sore, and the scent of yesterday's fire lingers in your rough spun tunic. Outside, the village is still cloaked in mist. Cocks crow drowsily in the distance. There's work ahead, of course, but first there's breakfast. It's nothing grand, just a bowl of pottage that's been simmering overnight, the flavors long gone, the contents indistinguishable. Still, it's food, and in your world, food is everything. To be a peasant in medieval Europe was to be intimately familiar with hunger, not necessarily starvation, but hunger as a constant shadow. And so, the daily diet of a medieval peasant, though seemingly dull to modern eyes, was a strategic pattern of survival. It was repetitive, utilitarian, and deeply tied to the seasons, the soil, and the lords who controlled them. Most peasants didn't own land. They worked on manors, toiled in fields, and paid dues in crops or labor. But they did have small garden plots, called tofts, and the occasional pig or hen. These were precious. Their diet, then, was a careful negotiation between what they grew, what they were allowed to keep, and what the weather didn't ruin. At the center of this diet stood bread. But this wasn't the soft, white, fluffy loaf you might imagine. Theirs was coarse, dense, and heavy, often made from rye, barley, or maslin, a mixed grain of wheat and rye. White bread existed, but it was reserved for the elite, for monasteries and feasts. For the peasant, bread was brown or grayish, sometimes flecked with bits of chaff or tiny pebbles from imperfect milling. It could chip your teeth. Baking was rarely done in the home. Many villages had communal ovens, and peasants would bring their dough to be baked once or twice a week, paying a small fee or sharing a portion of the loaf with the Lord. Between baking days, bread grew stale, but nothing was wasted. Hardened loaves could be softened with broth or beer. Waste, after all, was a luxury no one could afford. Accompanying the bread was pottage, a thick stew of grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables were on hand. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and turnips formed the base of most pottages, with garlic and herbs like parsley or dill added for flavor. If a family had beans or peas, these were tossed in. Lentils were rare, but highly prized when available. The pottage, simmered over the hearth, sometimes for days, with ingredients added as they came. It was the ultimate one-pot meal. Pottage wasn't just food. It was time. It was heat. It was smell. It was the sound of bubbling, the center of domestic life. And it was also deeply boring, but it filled bellies. Meat, contrary to modern belief, was rare. Most peasants went weeks without tasting it. Hunting was illegal for commoners, as forests and game were property of the nobility. Even rabbits, considered lowly by modern standards, were protected. If you were caught poaching, you could lose a hand, or your life. That said, if a pig was slaughtered, nothing went to waste. The feet, ears, blood, and intestines were used. The meat was salted, smoked, and shared sparingly. One pig might feed a family through an entire winter, not by daily feasts, but by careful rationing. More commonly, people consumed dairy, eggs, or fish, especially salted herring, which was abundant and cheap due to the thriving trade networks of the North Sea and the Baltic. The church played an enormous role in what peasants ate. Over 100 days a year were designated as fasting days, when meat, eggs, and dairy were forbidden. On these days, the poor actually ate better, ironically, as lords might distribute fish, or monasteries might offer free meals to the community. On regular days, peasants might add a poached egg to their pottage or have a bit of cheese made from goat or cow milk, though most milk went quickly sour without refrigeration and was used for making curds. Breakfast, as a concept, was minimal. You might drink a weak beer, nibble on a bit of cold bread, and get back to work. Lunch, eaten midday in the fields, consisted of more bread, some onion, perhaps a bit of soft cheese wrapped in cloth. Dinner was the main meal, shared around the hearth after dark. And always, there was beer. Not the frothy, carbonated drink we imagine today, but a cloudy, flat brew known as small beer. Made from grains like barley and fermented just enough to purify the water, it was drunk by everyone, men, women, children, throughout the day. It provided hydration, calories, and a mild sense of relief from the drudgery of labor. Stronger beer, with more alcohol, was rarer and often reserved for celebrations or sold at the tavern. A diet so heavy in carbohydrates, light in protein, and repetitive to the point of monotony produced health issues. Dental problems were common. Malnutrition, especially in lean years, led to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and seasonal illnesses. Yet many peasants lived into their 40s or 50s, a respectable age given the hazards of childbirth, accidents, and disease. Still, the rhythm of meals gave life structure. The turning of the seasons was marked by what foods became available. Spring meant wild greens like nettles or sorrel. Summer brought berries, fresh beans, and cabbage. Autumn was harvest time. Grains, onions, nuts, apples. Winter was lean, dried peas, salted meat, and whatever root vegetables could be stored in a pit or cellar. Famine, while not constant, was a familiar threat. A bad harvest could mean hunger. 2 bad harvests in a row? That was disaster. In such times, people resorted to eating acorns, bark, or even clay. Chroniclers from the 14th century describe famine bread, a hideous mixture of ground-up tree bark, peas, and straw flour, barely edible and sometimes toxic. Yet what's striking is how stable the diet remained for centuries. While nobles feasted on boar, swan, and spices, the peasant diet was built on 4 essentials: grain, legumes, vegetables, and ale. These were the bricks of survival. Everything else, meat, fruit, milk, was a bonus. And despite the lack of variety, there were culinary strategies. Herbs, grown in gardens or foraged, played a quiet but essential role. They flavored food, aided digestion, and occasionally cured ailments. Garlic and onions, strong in both flavor and belief, were used not only to enhance taste, but to ward off illness and spirits. There's evidence that peasants sometimes used fermented cabbage or pickled turnips to preserve produce. These early forms of fermentation allowed them to stretch food further through cold months. In times of slight prosperity, after a good harvest or a feast day, there might be treats, a spiced oat cake, a bit of honey, or even a roasted apple. These were rare, but remembered. Oral traditions passed down recipes in simple, rhythmic verse, more often recited than written. Cooking was practical, not creative. You cooked what you had. You used what was left. And still, families gathered, bowls in hand, around the fire. Today, we might find this menu monotonous, but for the medieval peasant, it was a careful balancing act between enough and not enough, between survival and starvation. And yet one can't help but wonder, did they ever tire of it? Did the taste of barley pottage on day 87 feel different than on day 3? Did they dream of sweetness, or simply appreciate fullness? If food was the lifeblood of a peasant's survival, then the act of eating was its heartbeat. It ticked steadily through the day, carving routine from hardship. Yet even the most mundane bite, hard bread dipped in broth, or a spoonful of cabbage pottage, took on layers of meaning depending on when, where, and with whom it was consumed. The rhythm of peasant life revolved around communal meals, often taken with extended family or neighbors. Privacy was scarce. A cottage might house multiple generations, sleeping, working, and eating in the same room. There was usually one hearth, one pot, and one common bowl or trough. Utensils were rare. Many ate with their fingers, scooping up porridge or beans with coarse bread. Spoons, if owned, were carved from wood and often shared. Meals, however, simple, were social acts. Even in fatigue, even after endless hours of plowing or threshing, people gathered. Children sat close to the fire. Elders whispered memories between bites, and the warmth of cooked food offered a momentary balm to bodies bent by labor. The peasant table, such as it was, served a dual purpose. It was both a place of nourishment and a reflection of hierarchy. The father or eldest male often sat at the head, distributing food in order of age or perceived worth. The best bits of meat, if any, went to him. The last ladle of broth to the youngest or least helpful. This practice was less about cruelty and more about tradition. In a world of limited resources, structure was survival. But food wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was spiritual, seasonal, and steeped in symbolism. The church calendar, with its multitude of saints' days, feasts, and fasts, dictated much of the peasants' eating habits. While the upper clergy enjoyed feasts of roast fowl and fish stuffed with saffron and dates, peasants adapted religious expectations with what they had. Fasting, for example, was technically meant to curb indulgence. But for most peasants, there was nothing to curb. So fasting days, Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, were simply no-meat days, which looked remarkably similar to every other day. On Fridays, they might eat a bit of dried herring if they could afford it, or else rely on onions and beans. Lent, however, could be particularly harsh. For 6 weeks, meat, eggs, dairy, and sometimes even fats were forbidden. Almond milk, imported and costly, was used by the rich as a substitute. Peasants? They simply did without. Ironically, religious feast days, of which there were many, offered rare chances for better meals. Harvest festivals, saints' days, Easter, and Christmas might see the village come alive with shared dishes, dancing, and warmth. These moments, though brief, were cherished. A communal pig slaughter in the autumn wasn't just about meat. It was an event. Neighbors gathered, the carcass divided, the offal cooked quickly, and the meat salted for the months ahead. The blood might be caught in a wooden bowl and stirred into barley for a kind of early black pudding. Each festival had its food associations. At Lammas Day, August 1st, the first bread made from the new grain was offered to the church. All Saints' Day, November 1st, marked the beginning of winter meals, hearty, long-cooked, salted, and dried. At Michaelmas, September 29th, if a goose was available, it was eaten. Not for taste, but because it was said to protect against poverty for the coming year. The act of sharing food extended into informal customs as well. Leasing, or gleaning, allowed the poor to gather stray ears of wheat from the fields after harvest. Some lords encouraged this, others punished it. In villages, almsgiving was an expectation. Better-off households were supposed to share extra produce, milk, or bread with those in need, especially during hard winters. Whether this always happened is doubtful, but the idea remained deeply embedded in religious and cultural life. Peasant food wasn't merely constrained by poverty, it was molded by technology. Grinding grain required a mill. Some villages had watermills or windmills controlled by the manor, often charging fees. Home milling was arduous, done with a hand quern, grinding grain between two heavy stones. It could take hours just to produce enough flour for one family. Baking also required either access to a communal oven or a well-maintained hearth, which meant reliable wood. Firewood gathering could be restricted by local laws or forest rights. Even the act of cooking was political. Culinary tools were simple. Iron cauldrons suspended over the fire were the centerpiece. Clay pots and pans were used when available, but fragile. Salt, precious and heavily taxed, was used sparingly. Fermentation and drying were more common methods of preserving food. Herbs and wild plants substituted for spices, pennyroyal, horehound, and yarrow for seasoning and medicine alike. Peasants knew their hedgerows and fields well, what to eat, what to avoid, what healed a wound or soothed a cough. Interestingly, while the nobility used spices to demonstrate wealth, peasants used pungent herbs to survive indigestion, treat infections, and distract from food spoilage. There are mentions of mixing garlic with vinegar to disguise rancid meat, or adding mustard seeds to mask bitter flavors. As trade routes expanded in the later Middle Ages, small luxuries filtered downward. Honey, once reserved for the monastery or the mead maker, could occasionally sweeten a peasant's oatcake. Apples and plums, especially in regions like Normandy or southern Germany, were gathered and dried. Yet these remained seasonal indulgences. A winter apple was a treasure. A spoonful of jam? Practically a myth. But more than scarcity, the true hallmark of the peasant diet was its monotony. A 14th century chronicler once remarked that the peasant tastes the same bowl until he can no longer tell which year it was first made. Whether exaggerated or not, it speaks to a truth. Variety was not a goal. Sustenance was. Novelty belonged to feasts and festivals. Ordinary days ran together in their sameness. Still, there were occasional shocks. Famine, caused by crop failure, war, or disease, could suddenly transform even the dullest diet into a matter of desperation. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, one of the most devastating in Europe's medieval history, forced people to consume bark, roots, and even the bodies of executed criminals, according to chroniclers. Horses, dogs, and rats disappeared from towns. Grain prices soared. People fought over spoiled bread. And yet, these famines were not constant. Most years were lean, not catastrophic. They required planning, rationing, and knowing precisely how long a sack of peas could last. Another factor that shaped food habits was labor cycles. During planting and harvest, meals were larger. Extra bread, more beer. Lords were expected to feed laborers who helped bring in the harvest. Harvest ale, brewed stronger than usual, marked the end of work and the beginning of celebration. On the other hand, during winter, food was tighter. Meals were smaller, and hunger grew sharper. Despite the simplicity of their diets, peasants maintained an impressive food literacy. They understood crop rotation, soil exhaustion, and seed preservation. They could identify edible fungi, understand the timing of fermentation, and knew how to keep a root cellar at just the right dampness. Their knowledge was practical, passed down through example, not written recipes. To survive, one had to remember everything: how long a dried bean took to cook, when milk curdled, what berries were safe, and how to feed 6 mouths with 4 onions and a crust. What is perhaps most remarkable about this daily rhythm is its resilience. Wars came and went, lords changed, plagues swept through villages, but the basic act of boiling a pot of pottage, breaking a loaf of rye bread, and pouring a dipper of small beer, these remained. And it makes one wonder, in such a world where variety was a rare guest, what did it mean to crave? Did peasants dream of flavors they'd never tasted? Or was the absence of novelty itself a comfort, a steady drumbeat in a world often ruled by chaos? The medieval peasant's diet, coarse, repetitive, and unremarkable to modern tastes, might seem like a culinary footnote, but from its monotony emerged deep consequences. Over centuries, these humble foodways subtly reshaped health, policy, economy, and even the cuisines we still encounter today. To begin with, the nutritional profile of the peasant diet was not as bleak as it may first appear. True, protein was scarce and fats limited, but diets rich in grains, legumes, and vegetables provided a reasonable base of energy and fiber. Most peasants consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 calories per day, often more during harvest periods. Oats, rye, barley, beans, cabbage, turnips, onions, and leeks formed the foundation of their nutrition. These were carbohydrate-heavy diets, but they included enough plant-based variety to provide vitamins and minerals, particularly when wild greens, herbs, and nuts were added. Iron was present in beans and lentils, though its absorption was limited without vitamin C. Still, scurvy and other deficiency diseases were relatively rare compared to what came later in more urbanized and processed diets. Where this system faltered was in its vulnerability to shock. A single bad harvest could cascade into famine. A failed rye crop meant no bread. A wet summer could rot stored grains. A war might prevent planting altogether. Unlike elite diets, peasant food relied heavily on seasonality and regional weather. Stability. As such, populations were chronically undernourished, not starved necessarily, but never quite full either. This chronic undernourishment had lasting effects. Stature is a good proxy for nutrition over time. Archaeological digs across Europe reveal that medieval peasants were shorter than their Roman predecessors, by several inches. Their teeth show. Heavy wear from stone-gritted bread, and signs of linear enamel hypoplasia, a marker of childhood malnutrition, are common. Yet there's also evidence of hardiness. Many skeletal remains show signs of healed injuries and long life despite physical labor. Interestingly, their gut biomes, reconstructed from preserved latrine samples and soil, show remarkable biodiversity. These were not sterile guts. They were teeming ecosystems, constantly fed by fiber, fermented food, and exposure to soil and livestock. In an accidental way, the medieval diet promoted microbial richness, a trait modern medicine has only recently begun to appreciate again. At the social level, food distribution was both a reflection and reinforcement of feudal structures. Lords controlled mills, ovens, forests, and hunting rights. In some regions, peasants could not grind their own grain without paying a fee, nor could they fish or gather wood freely. These restrictions created deep resentments. Indeed, food rights were often central to rebellion. Take, for example, the Jacquerie Uprising in France, 1358, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion in England, 1381. While taxes were the stated cause, underlying tensions included anger at manorial control over basic necessities. Peasants didn't just want political rights, they wanted access to land, water, wood, and food. The control of ovens and ale brewing was not just about cooking, it was about autonomy. As towns expanded, so did market economies, and peasant diets began to shift. The introduction of cash crops, like hops for beer or flax for linen, meant less land available for food. But it also introduced more trade. Peasants began to sell eggs, cheese, and surplus beans. This small shift allowed for the purchase of things once considered luxuries: salt, vinegar, dried fish, perhaps even a rare orange or piece of ginger. Trade routes, especially after the Crusades and into the later medieval period, brought in new goods: cinnamon, pepper, sugar, and rice. These items were first reserved for the nobility, but slowly trickled downward. Sugar remained a rare treat, but peasants occasionally encountered it in monastery food or at a noble's feast. Even if they didn't consume these items, they became aware of them, which in itself began to shift culinary expectations. One of the most dramatic dietary transformations came from monasteries. While monks lived under vows of humility, many religious houses developed sophisticated kitchens and gardens. They brewed beer, maintained orchards, kept bees for honey, and developed preservation techniques. Recipes, though rare, were more likely to be recorded in monastic settings than peasant homes. Over time, these recipes and food customs filtered into broader society. Additionally, monasteries offered alms, feeding the poor with surplus food. This created an early form of institutional charity, but also solidified hierarchies. Food was a gift from the powerful, reinforcing dependence. Even in charity, food distribution was a mechanism of control. Culinary change accelerated with contact across continents. Although the true revolution wouldn't come until after 1492, the late Middle Ages saw the slow infiltration of Eastern ingredients. Rice, citrus, sugarcane. These were initially reserved for the rich, but began appearing in panis ad mensum, table bread, or in festive puddings shared during holidays. Still, most peasants would never taste rice or sugar in their lifetimes. Instead, their staples, barley, rye, oats, persisted through generations. It's remarkable how durable these foods were. Oatmeal and pottage existed in the British Isles for over 1,000 years. Black bread, made from rye and bran, persisted across northern and eastern Europe well into the 19th century. Sauerkraut, pickled herring, beer, and onion stew remained in rural diets, linking the medieval peasant to modern rural communities in subtle but powerful ways. Some traditions survive today not as food, but as ritual. Harvest festivals, for instance, still feature communal feasts and bread baking. The Christmas goose, the Shrove Tuesday pancake, the Easter egg, all draw roots from peasant customs shaped by the rhythms of feast and famine, labor and Lent. From a macro perspective, the peasant diet played a role in shaping population growth. Following the agricultural improvements of the 11th, 13th centuries, such as the three-field system, better plows, and improved crop rotation, Europe saw population expansion. More people meant more food production, but also more pressure. On land. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it reversed this trend dramatically, but the plague also transformed peasant life. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Surviving peasants could demand better terms, higher wages, and in some cases more freedom over their food choices. Meat consumption briefly rose among the working classes in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Records show increased access to mutton and beef in some regions. Peasants planted orchards, kept bees, raised pigs. For a short time, the balance tipped in their favor. And then, slowly, the enclosure movement in England and land centralization across Europe pushed peasants off open fields. Common lands disappeared. Large-scale sheep farming replaced communal agriculture. This narrowed food access once more, and many former peasants became wage laborers in cities. Yet the habits developed over centuries persisted. Stews, porridges, breads, and beers made from local grains are still staples across Europe. Many national dishes have roots in these medieval kitchens. France's pot au feu, Germany's Eintopf, the UK's peas pudding and shepherd's pie, all echo the one-pot peasant meals of old. In the end, the medieval peasant's food story is not just one of hardship. It's one of quiet endurance, of survival in the face of constraint, of building a food culture with little and passing it down, meal by meal, loaf by loaf, until the flavors and habits found permanence. And so, the next time you stir a pot of beans or eat a slice of rye bread, consider this. How much of your modern meal is built on a peasant's forgotten bowl? How many of our culinary comforts were once tools of survival? You might imagine ancient Rome through its more glamorous symbols, marble temples, polished togas, and forums echoing with the voices of senators. But behind the gleam of the empire stood an infrastructure that kept Roman society literally clean, or at least as clean as the time allowed. And nothing in that world was more unglamorous, more vital, or more surprisingly well-organized than the world of Roman laundry. The task of keeping clothing clean, particularly the crisp white togas worn by Roman citizens, was not a simple matter of scrubbing fabric in a stream. It was industrial, it was foul, and it was absolutely essential. The Romans even had a name for professional laundries, Phalonicae, plural of Phalonica, the laundry shop. These establishments were commonplace throughout the empire, operating in cities from Rome to Pompeii to provincial outposts in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa. The Pholones, or laundry workers, were the central figures of this story. They cleaned togas, tunics, and linens for Rome's middle and upper classes. Pholones were not slaves, at least not always. Many were free or freedmen, often working in family-run businesses. Their job? To restore garments, particularly the woolen ones worn most commonly, to a state of cleanliness and brightness. This was more than aesthetics. In Roman culture, a clean toga was a social necessity. A soiled or yellowing garment was a mark of disrespectability. For men, especially those engaged in civic life or business, their toga was not just clothing. It was a visible display of personal discipline, wealth, and class. In this way, laundry supported the very visual language of Roman hierarchy. So, what did this cleaning process involve? The first step was soaking the garments in a cleaning solution, and here's where things get interesting. Romans used human urine as the primary agent. That's right, urine. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, which is a powerful degreasing agent. Ammonia breaks down organic materials like oils, sweat, and dirt, lifting them from the dense wool fibers. In the absence of modern soaps, urine was arguably the most effective option available. Urine was collected from public latrines or special vessels placed on street corners. In some cities, like Rome itself, a urine tax, vectigal urinae, was imposed by Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century CE. The collected urine was then sold to laundries, where it was diluted with water and used as a cleansing bath. In fact, public urinals were sometimes called Vespasiani, a term that endures in parts of Italy today. In a typical Phalonica, garments would be placed in stone basins containing this urine water solution. Then came the next step, stomping. Pholones, often barefoot, would climb into these vats and trample the clothes. Think of it like stomping grapes, but far less pleasant. For hours at a time, they rhythmically marched in place, churning garments through the urine bath, loosening dirt and oils. The process was labor-intensive, pungent, and physically grueling. Some vats were heated slightly to improve effectiveness, intensifying the smell further. After stomping, garments were rinsed in clean water, then scrubbed using abrasives, fine. Sand, fuller's earth, a kind of clay, or sometimes ashes. These agents help draw out remaining oils and dirt. They might also be used with brushes made from twigs or bristles. The garments were rinsed again, sometimes several times, before being wrung out and hung to dry in courtyards or on rooftops. But clean didn't yet mean finished. The final phase was finishing and whitening, particularly for togas and other ceremonial garments. To enhance whiteness, Pholones applied sulfur fumes. This was done by placing garments in sealed rooms or cabinets and burning sulfur nearby. The resulting gas, sulfur dioxide, acted as a bleaching agent, much like how it is still used industrially today. While the method was effective, the fumes were hazardous. Ancient sources don't describe the health effects in detail, but it's likely that Pholones suffered respiratory issues over time. Beyond whitening, garments also had to be pressed and styled. Roman clothing often featured pleats and folds, especially the toga, which had to drape in specific ways. Pholones used special irons, some of which were hollow and filled with hot coals, to press folds into garments. They might use wooden molds or even press clothes beneath heavy stones. Folded togas were tied into place using cords and left to set before being returned to the client. Interestingly, laundry shops were also social spaces. They employed multiple workers, often members of the same family. In urban neighborhoods, Pholoniki were hives of activity. Workers sang rhythmically while stomping garments, a kind of occupational chant. The environment was noisy, smelly, and industrious. If a Roman street smelled sharply of ammonia or sulfur, chances are a Phallonica was nearby. The archaeologically preserved Phallonica of Stephanus in Pompeii gives us remarkable insights. The building, located near the city's center, was equipped with multiple basins, rinsing areas, drying courtyards, and pressing tools. A painted fresco at its entrance proudly depicts the tools of the trade and celebrates the Pholones' importance to city life. Stephanus's Phallonica even had a sales counter, suggesting that some laundries doubled as used clothing shops, buying old garments, cleaning them, and reselling to others. That's right. Romans engaged in early forms of clothing recycling. Poorer citizens often purchased second-hand garments. The same toga might pass through many hands, cleaned and repaired each time, before finally becoming rags or bedding. The laundry trade, despite its unsavory aspects, held real status in Roman society. Inscriptions and gravestones tell of proud Fulones who left money to guilds, sponsored public games, or served as civic officials. The Collegium Fulonum, a formal guild, existed in many cities, advocating for its members and participating in local religious festivals. Fulones even had a patron deity, Minerva, the goddess of crafts, wisdom, and, among many things, cleansing. Of course, not everyone admired the trade. Elite Roman writers occasionally mocked Fulones for their smells or low status. But their critiques often acknowledged the Fulones' essential role. Even emperors needed clean garments. Even senators had their togas bleached. There's also a deep irony here. While Romans prized cleanliness and associated white clothing with virtue and citizenship, the process that made those garments white was messy, filthy, and reliant on bodily waste. The metaphor almost writes itself. The purity of Rome depended on the labor of the stained and stinking. Still, Fulones carried on. Their services were vital. Their techniques, practical. Their workshops, though unpleasant, operated with efficiency and precision that any modern dry cleaner might recognize. In a society obsessed with appearances, they provided the means to maintain them. And so we're left with a question. How did a civilization capable of such aesthetic ideals rely so heavily on something as humble and as human as urine to keep itself spotless? You've already stepped into the pungent, bustling world of Roman laundry, and perhaps you're still shaking off the stinging fumes of ammonia and sulfur. But to truly understand how this corner of Roman life operated and why it endured across centuries of empire, we need to look closer at the people who made laundry their life's work. The Fulones weren't simply laborers stomping garments in vats of urine. They were part of a highly organized professional culture, complete with guilds, rituals, patron gods, and a place in Rome's moral and civic imagination. Let us begin with the Collegium Fulonum, the Fullers' Guild. In Roman society, many professions were organized into collegia, or professional associations. These were more than trade unions. They were religious, social, and civic institutions. Fullers had their own collegium in many Roman cities, and records of these have survived in inscriptions and municipal documents, particularly in Pompeii, Ostia, and Rome itself. Membership in the guild gave fullers access to a network of peers. Together, they coordinated pricing standards, negotiated access to water supplies, and protected the trade's legal and social status. Like many Roman guilds, the Collegium Fulonum had a religious dimension. Fullers regularly made offerings to Minerva, their patron deity, and sometimes to Hercules, a figure associated with labor and endurance. Shrines might be kept within Fulonicae, or members might contribute to temples and festivals honoring these gods. Minerva was particularly important. As the goddess of crafts and wisdom, she symbolized both the skill and industriousness of the Fulones. In some regions, fullers participated in the annual Quinquatria, a 5-day festival honoring Minerva with parades, games, and offerings. Participation wasn't just piety, it was public relations. The fuller who gave generously to the temple or sponsored public entertainments gained status in the eyes of the town. This civic presence meant that even those who worked in one of the least glamorous sectors of Roman society could attain respect and recognition. Social mobility, while limited in Rome, was not impossible. In some inscriptions, we find Fulones who rose from slavery to guild membership and then into modest prosperity. In one notable case from Pompeii, a man named Lucius Veranius Hypsius, once enslaved, had become a freedman and prominent fuller. His tomb inscription proudly listed his roles, including his office within the Collegium and his contributions to local religious rites. We can also find honorific graffiti and paintings in Fulonicae themselves, portraying the workers not just as toiling laborers, but as members of an industrious brotherhood. These decorations weren't just for vanity, they advertised professionalism. Much like a barber pole or a tailor's sign in later centuries, They assured passers-by that this was a reputable place to bring one's garments. In a city where appearance mattered as much as speech, the Folonica was an anchor of public presentation. And the garments? Let's dwell on those a little longer. Roman clothing wasn't uniform. While togas might symbolize citizenship, they were worn mostly by men, and primarily for formal occasions. Everyday garments included tunics, cloaks, stole for women, and various types of mantles or wraps. These were primarily wool, with linen and imported cotton or silk, reserved for the wealthier classes. Wool was durable, but challenging to clean. It absorbed oils and odors easily, and it retained water when wet. That's why the fulling process focused so heavily on degreasing and reshaping the fabric. Once wool garments were soaked, stomped, rinsed, and dried, they often needed reshaping, not unlike felting today. Without reshaping, a cleaned tunic might shrink or deform. Folones used wooden stretchers or mannequins to help return garments to their proper proportions. Color, too, was part of the job. While many garments were left their natural off-white, dyes were common, especially for decorative edges, stripes, or social markers like the latest clavis, the wide purple stripe of senators. Folones didn't dye garments themselves. That was a separate trade, but they sometimes had to handle dyed items. That meant knowing how to clean them without causing fading or bleed. It also meant navigating social rules. Some colors were reserved for certain classes. Accidentally or purposefully whitening a dyed garment, or vice versa, could offend a client, or worse, break a sumptuary law. And there were indeed laws governing clothing. Rome's legal code included sumptuary regulations restricting who could wear what. These weren't always enforced consistently, but they reflected how clothing was tied to identity. As such, a fuller's mistake could have social consequences. Laundry was not just about sanitation, it was about maintaining a person's place in the social hierarchy. The profession required attentiveness not only to fibers and folds, but to etiquette and legal nuance. In light of this, Folones developed a language of their own, a vocabulary of folds, treatments, and finishing styles. Some terms referred to the type of garment, others to the type of cleaning or treatment. While few of these terms survive, we know they existed because Roman writers occasionally mocked them in satire. Martial, for example, poked fun at fullers who exaggerated their knowledge of textiles or charged excessive fees for fancy-sounding techniques. But even satire is a form of acknowledgement. The Folones were part of the urban texture of Roman life, and not just in the capital. Archaeology tells us that even modest towns had laundries. Pompeii, with a population of around 11,000 before its destruction in 79 CE, had at least 5 Folonici and possibly more. These ranged in size from small household workshops to large commercial-scale laundries. The Folonica of Stephanus, which we mentioned earlier, was likely one of the largest and most successful. It included a shop front, a processing courtyard, and an array of basins and pressing tools, proof that Roman laundry could scale up. Outside Italy, laundries operated in provincial cities, adapting to local conditions. In North Africa, where water was scarcer, Folones built cisterns and rainwater channels to capture and reuse water. In colder climates like northern Gaul or Britannia, they may have had to dry garments indoors, using heated rooms, a logistical and engineering challenge. What's striking is how standardized these operations were. Whether in Gaul, Hispania, or Rome, the same 3-phase process appears again and again: urine soaking, rinsing and scrubbing, then pressing and finishing. It points to the diffusion of technical knowledge, probably shared through guild networks, apprenticeships, and informal training. Laundry was not a primitive endeavor. It was a practiced, reproducible craft, and it wasn't without its dangers. Fullers were exposed daily to toxic fumes, especially sulfur dioxide during the bleaching process. Long-term exposure could cause respiratory problems, though Roman sources are largely silent on this. It's not hard to imagine, though. Workers coughing, their hands raw from alkaline solutions, their clothes stained by the very garments they cleaned. Yet despite these conditions, Folones endured. Their services were never out of demand. Whether for senators or soldiers, merchants or magistrates, clean clothing was a non-negotiable requirement in Roman society. And so the fullers rose early, stomped their vats, sang their chants, and carried on the uncelebrated labor of keeping the empire presentable. But all of this leaves one final, unresolved curiosity. How did Phalanike survive or not after the fall of Rome? What happened to the profession as Roman cities declined, public waterworks failed, and urban economies shifted? As the Roman Empire began to fragment in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries CE, so too did the vast systems that had supported its daily rhythms. Roads became dangerous. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Trade slowed. Civic institutions weakened, and municipal funding, the lifeblood of urban infrastructure, dried up. The Fullones, once essential figures in urban life, found themselves confronting a quieter but no less relentless erosion, the slow collapse of public hygiene. At its peak, Rome's laundry system had thrived on infrastructure. Water was the fulcrum on which it turned. Clean water for rinsing, dirty water for processing, and a reliable supply of both. Roman aqueducts, among the most impressive engineering feats of the ancient world, brought fresh water from distant mountains into urban centers. Cities like Rome, Carthage, and Antioch pulsed with fountains, public baths, and even sewers. But as imperial revenues declined, many of these systems went unmaintained. Aqueducts collapsed under neglect or enemy sabotage. Without the constant work of stonecutters, engineers, and water inspectors, the Curatories Aquarum, freshwater access faltered. Phalanike, which relied on consistent heavy water usage, could not easily switch to well water or rain catching alone. Some likely shrank, others closed altogether. This deterioration did not occur overnight. In some regions, especially in the Eastern Empire, cities remained relatively stable for centuries. Constantinople, for example, maintained some level of Roman urban life deep into the Middle Ages. But in the West, and particularly in Italy and Gaul, the fall was more precipitous. Archaeological evidence gives us a partial picture. In Pompeii, buried in 79 CE, we see the Phalanike frozen in a moment of vibrant activity. But in sites like Ostia or southern Gaul, we find later layers where Phalanike go quiet. The vats remain, but they are no longer repaired. The tiles crumble. In some cases, they are repurposed, turned into stables, granaries, or simple storage. The specialized tools of fulling, wooden paddles, presses, treadstones, disappear from the record. Some of this loss may have been cultural. As cities declined, so too did the culture of urban dress and presentation. Toga wearing became less common by the 4th century, and tunics, cheaper, simpler, easier to clean, gained favor. In rural areas, practicality took precedence over display. If your social circle extended only to a handful of villagers, your garments didn't need whitening, pleating, or repressing. Laundry didn't vanish, but it reverted to the domestic sphere. And with the rise of Christianity, there was also a subtle change in values. While personal cleanliness remained important and many Christian writers encouraged modest washing, ostentatious grooming and elaborate garments were increasingly seen as worldly distractions. Tertullian, a 2nd century Christian writer, criticized the obsession with clothing, calling it a vanity that dulled the soul. Other early bishops wrote against the use of cosmetics, dyes, and fine linens. In such a climate, the services of fullers, especially those focused on bleaching and finishing, may have seemed unnecessary or even indulgent. Still, laundry never disappeared entirely. Instead, it adapted. By the 6th and 7th centuries, fulling work in Western Europe had migrated out of cities and into monasteries and manor estates. Monasteries, in particular, became custodians of practical knowledge: gardening, medicine, carpentry, and yes, laundering. Medieval monastic rules, such as the Rule of Saint Benedict, included references to laundering garments, especially for monks who worked in the fields. These were simpler, quieter operations, nothing like the busy, ammonia-steeped Phalanike of the Roman period. Yet some traditions persisted. In the Latin of the early Middle Ages, we still find references to fullo and related terms. Even the occupational surname Fuller, common in English and other Germanic languages, traces back to these Roman roots. So does the word walk in walker, a reference to the fulling process of treading on cloth. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as European cities revived, professional fullers re-emerged in a changed world. In places like Flanders and northern Italy, fulling became part of the textile manufacturing process, not just laundry. cloth was now fulled to make it denser, smoother, and more marketable before it was even made into garments. The work was still grueling, still pungent, and still necessary, but the Roman Follonica was no more. Why didn't Roman-style laundry survive in its original form? Partly because the world that sustained it, an empire built on infrastructure, legal codes, and civic pride, ceased to function. Partly, too, because Roman laundry was inseparable from Roman fashion, and when one declined, the other withered. But perhaps the real reason is more elemental. The Roman Follonica was a product of a deeply urban society, one that prioritized public image, political theater, and ritualized cleanliness. The fall of the Follonica was not a failure of technology. It was a shift in values, and it is worth pausing here to consider the Pholones themselves. For centuries, they labored in the backrooms of empire, not heroes, not generals, but men and women whose stomping feet echoed beneath the clamor of Rome. They cleaned the togas of magistrates, the tunics of soldiers, the veils of vestal virgins. They knew the weight of wool when wet, the sting of ammonia in their eyes, the satisfaction of a perfectly pressed seam. Their names, for the most part, have been lost. But their footprints remain, literally, in the stone basins they once tread. And their industry, however pungent, helped hold together the polished surface of Roman life. So when we think of Rome, not just its forums and columns, but its everyday people, let us spare a thought for the laundry workers, for the Pholones whose toil made the splendor possible. Who labored quietly so others might shine? Because what is civilization, really, without clean clothes? Imagine yourself sitting in a dimly lit room somewhere in a monastery, or a scribal workshop in the ancient or medieval world. The air is still, filled with the faint smell of parchment and ink. The room is quiet, except for the soft scratching sound of a quill on vellum or papyrus. Around you, scribes, men, and sometimes women, are hunched over long wooden tables, their eyes straining, as they painstakingly copy manuscripts by hand. There are no printing presses, no typewriters, no computers to speed the process. Every letter, every word must be recreated carefully, exactly as it appears in the original text, to preserve knowledge across generations. This repetitive and monotonous labor was the backbone of preserving history, religion, literature, law, and science for centuries. It was an enormous task, essential for keeping culture alive, yet profoundly dull and prone to human error. The scribes worked in small, cramped rooms, sometimes called scriptoria, under poor lighting conditions. They often worked for hours, without rest, their eyes weary, their hands cramped from holding quills and ink pots. The process of copying a manuscript was painstaking. First, the scribe would prepare the writing surface, papyrus in Egypt and the Mediterranean, vellum or parchment made from animal skins in medieval Europe. These materials were expensive and delicate, requiring careful handling. The original manuscript would be read aloud or silently, and the scribe would reproduce the text, letter by letter. Often, the scribe had to copy texts that were already copies, several generations removed from the original source. Because every text was copied by hand, the possibility of scribal errors was inevitable. These errors could be as small as a misspelled word, or as significant as omitted lines or whole passages. The mistakes occurred for many reasons: fatigue, distractions, misunderstandings of the original language, or simple slips of the pen. The scribe's job was complicated by the nature of ancient scripts. For example, early Latin manuscripts often used scriptura continua, meaning there were no spaces between words. This made it difficult to distinguish where one word ended and another began. In Greek manuscripts, many letters looked similar, increasing the chance of confusion. Some scripts had ligatures, where two or more letters were joined, which could be misread or miscopied. One common type of error was haplography, where the scribe accidentally skipped a letter, word, or phrase because the eye jumped from one similar sequence of letters to another. For example, if the text had the phrase, "in the land and in the city," the scribe might accidentally skip the repeated "in the second time, creating a shorter but inaccurate sentence. Conversely, ditography happened when a scribe copied a letter, word, or phrase twice by mistake, often because their eyes went back to a previous section of the text and repeated it. Another problem was homoioteluton, where lines or sentences ending in similar sequences caused the scribe's eye to jump and skip entire lines unintentionally. This is especially common in poetic or liturgical texts, where endings repeat. Sometimes errors were introduced because the scribe didn't understand the meaning of the text fully. They might attempt to correct what they perceived as mistakes, making changes to grammar, spelling, or word choice. In other cases, scribes might harmonize texts, especially biblical manuscripts, adjusting passages to align with other versions or doctrinal preferences. While some scribes were highly trained and careful, others were less experienced. Scribes, working in busy scriptoria, sometimes rushed to meet deadlines or produce many copies, increasing the chance of mistakes. The quality of ink, quills, and writing surfaces also affected the legibility and accuracy of copies. Despite these difficulties, many scribes worked with great diligence and took pride in their craft. Monasteries in medieval Europe often had libraries where monks dedicated years to copying texts. These scribes developed various techniques to minimize errors, including proofreading and collation, comparing copies against each other to identify and correct mistakes. The work was crucial because the survival of texts depended on accurate copying. A single scribal error could cause confusion for centuries. For example, a miscopied date or name could change the understanding of a historical event. A mistranslated phrase could influence religious doctrine or legal interpretation. One famous example involves the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Over centuries, numerous manuscripts of the Septuagint were copied, and variations crept in, leading to different interpretations of key biblical passages. Scholars today use textual criticism, analyzing variations among manuscripts, to reconstruct the most accurate original texts. Another example is the Historia Augusta, a collection of biographies of Roman emperors from the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. This work contains inconsistencies and fabrications, partly due to errors and deliberate alterations by scribes and editors. These distortions have complicated historians' understanding of the period. Beyond textual accuracy, scribal errors sometimes had unexpected historical consequences. Imagine a cleric copying a charter or law and accidentally changing a single number or phrase. That could alter land ownership rights or taxation rules. In other cases, transcription errors in medical or scientific texts could lead to dangerous misunderstandings. One such case involves the transmission of medical knowledge from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen through Arabic scholars to medieval Europe. Some mistranslations and copying errors distorted anatomical knowledge and treatment methods, influencing medical practice for centuries. The sheer volume of manuscripts produced across the ancient and medieval world means that scribal errors were widespread and inevitable. But thanks to the efforts of dedicated scribes, libraries, and later the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, much knowledge was preserved. Yet every ancient manuscript you might encounter today, whether a dusty volume in a university, library, or a digital scan online, is a copy of a copy of a copy, with each stage introducing its own tiny imperfections. The chain is long, fragile, and fascinating. So the next time you read a historical text, a religious scripture, or a classical poem, remember the humble scribes whose repetitive, tedious labor preserved these works, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes brilliantly. Their mistakes remind us that history itself is a human story, written not only by great events and people, but by the quiet, often boring work of preservation. But this raises an intriguing question. How have these scribal errors shaped the way history and knowledge were recorded, transmitted, and understood? And how much of what we accept as fact might have been altered by a tired scribe's slip of the pen? Having understood the painstaking process of manuscript copying and the human frailty involved, it's time to explore how these scribal errors did not remain confined to dusty manuscripts, but instead rippled outward, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, shaping history, culture, religion, and knowledge in surprising ways. First, consider the scale at which these errors propagated. Unlike a single mistake in a modern printed book, an error in an ancient or medieval manuscript could be replicated countless times as that copy became the source for future copies. Over centuries, the same error might spread across libraries and continents, becoming part of a text's accepted tradition. These accidents were often institutionalized without anyone realizing they originated in human fallibility. One of the most consequential fields affected by scribal errors was religious texts, especially the Bible. Because these texts were copied and recopied over centuries, variations proliferated. Some differences were minor, spelling variations, for example. Others were more meaningful, altering phrases and even theological concepts. Take, for example, the Johannine comma, 1 John 5:7-8, a short phrase present in some Latin manuscripts but absent in the earliest Greek texts. This passage explicitly references the Trinity, a core Christian doctrine. Its presence or absence has been a subject of scholarly debate for centuries. The phrase likely originated from a scribal edition or gloss that was later copied into the main text and became canonical in some traditions. This example shows how a minor scribal interpolation could influence theological understanding and debates. Similarly, in the New Testament, variations in manuscripts about Jesus' sayings or actions can reflect scribal corrections, harmonizations, or errors. These textual differences have shaped centuries of biblical scholarship and interpretation. Beyond religion, historical chronicles were vulnerable to the same issues. Medieval chronicles, which recorded the deeds of kings, battles, and events, were copied by scribes who sometimes introduced errors, accidental or intentional. For instance, errors in dates could shift the timeline of an event, leading to confusion about the order or causation of historical developments. In some cases, scribal errors led to the creation of myths and legends. One famous example is the legend of the Curse of the Ninth, linked to the composer Gustav Mahler, but arising partly from misunderstandings and miscopying of musical manuscripts and anecdotes. While not ancient history, it illustrates how mistakes can be magnified into cultural phenomena. On a more mundane but significant level, scribal errors influenced legal documents. Medieval legal manuscripts often contained errors in wording that could change the meaning of contracts, land grants, or laws. In societies where oral testimony was less reliable or less used, the written document was the final authority. An error could unjustly deprive someone of land or privileges, or conversely protect the rights of others. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, was a massive survey of landholdings in England. Despite its detail and purpose, scribal errors in entries led to disputes centuries later over land ownership and taxation. The transmission of scientific and medical texts also suffered from scribal imperfections. Ancient Greek and Roman medical treatises were copied and recopied by Byzantine, Arabic, and European scholars. Mistakes in copying measurements, symptoms, or treatments sometimes introduced misunderstandings that persisted in medical knowledge. For instance, the Greek physician Galen's works were translated into Arabic and Latin. Errors in translation and copying occasionally altered descriptions of anatomy or treatment recommendations. These inaccuracies sometimes delayed medical progress or led to dangerous practices. Even classical literature was not immune. Works of Homer, Virgil, and Ovid passed through countless hands, with scribes occasionally altering lines, whether deliberately to clarify or accidentally through misreading. Sometimes entire passages were added or omitted, changing the flavor or meaning of the text. Such was the case with the Iliad and the Odyssey. Different manuscript traditions contain variant lines and episodes. The study of these variants, known as textual criticism, helps modern scholars attempt to reconstruct the most authentic version. But absolute certainty is elusive. An especially intriguing consequence of scribal error is how it influenced language development. Copying errors sometimes introduced new spellings, words, or grammatical structures, which over time entered everyday use. In this way, scribal mistakes contributed to the evolution of languages such as Latin into the Romance languages. Errors also influenced maps and geographical knowledge. Medieval map makers, cartographers, copied earlier maps and texts about lands and peoples. Misinterpretations or mistakes in copying led to legendary places like Prester John's Kingdom or the Isle of Brazil. These cartographic errors shaped exploration and imagination for centuries. Not all scribal errors were accidental. Some were deliberate, known as scribal emendations. Scribes sometimes corrected texts according to their understanding, theological beliefs, or political agendas. Such emendations can obscure original meanings and reflect the values of the copying culture rather than the original author. For example, Christian scribes in the Middle Ages often adjusted pagan texts to align with Christian morals or censored content deemed inappropriate. This blending of preservation and alteration complicates the modern task of historians and philologists. In some cases, scribes fabricated texts entirely, attributing them falsely to ancient authors to give them authority. The Donation of Constantine, a document purportedly transferring authority over Rome and the Western Empire to the Pope, was later exposed as a forgery, but it influenced medieval politics for centuries. So how did scholars deal with this tangle of errors and alterations? The rise of textual criticism in the Renaissance and beyond marked a turning point. Scholars like Erasmus, Lockman, and Tischendorf painstakingly compared manuscript traditions, noting differences and attempting to reconstruct the closest possible original texts. Their work formed the foundation of modern philology and biblical scholarship. Today, with digital tools, scholars have access to thousands of manuscript images, allowing unprecedented analysis of scribal variations. Still, the fundamental problem remains. Every text is a product of human hands, subject to mistakes, interpretations, and cultural filters. What this means for you, the reader or student of history, is that our understanding of the past is always mediated, not just by what happened, but by how it was recorded and transmitted. History is, in part, a story of how scribes wrote, copied, and sometimes rewrote the past. This invites reflection on the nature of truth and memory. How much of what we consider historical fact is shaped by the small, invisible acts of copying? How do we separate fact from error, original from alteration? As we continue to examine the effects of scribal errors, consider that these tiny slips of the pen are part of a larger human story, one where knowledge is fragile, contested, and perpetually rewritten. As we reach the conclusion of our journey into the world of scribal errors, it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of these mistakes and the lessons they offer both to historians and to anyone curious about how knowledge is preserved and passed down. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the production of texts, dramatically reducing the incidence of copying errors. With movable type, books could be printed quickly and uniformly. However, the printing press did not instantly end textual errors. Early printers still had to set type by hand, and human mistakes, misplaced letters, typesetting errors, or poor proofreading continued to occur. Still, the scale and impact of errors diminished significantly compared to centuries of manual copying. Despite modern technology, the core challenge remains: how to preserve accuracy and transmission. Even today, digital texts can suffer from errors, typos, formatting mistakes, or corrupted files. But the margins for error are much smaller, and corrections can be made swiftly and globally. Returning to ancient manuscripts, the painstaking work of modern textual critics, historians, and philologists has enabled us to reconstruct more reliable versions of many important texts. Scholars compare thousands of manuscripts, noting variations and weighing the likelihood of errors or deliberate changes. This process is meticulous, often boring, but vital to understanding our cultural and historical heritage. One of the most famous examples is the New Testament, where textual criticism has helped scholars establish a reliable critical edition, despite thousands of manuscript variations. Similarly, classical Greek and Latin texts have benefited from centuries of scholarship aimed at disentangling scribal errors from original writings. But scribal errors also remind us of the human element behind history. Every text we read is a product of people, often anonymous, sometimes tired or distracted, doing repetitive, dull work to keep knowledge alive. This should humble us and inspire appreciation for the quiet perseverance that sustains civilization. In me. A way, scribal errors are also a metaphor for the impermanence and fluidity of history and knowledge. History is not a fixed set of facts, but a living conversation between past and present, shaped by transmission, interpretation, and sometimes misinterpretation. The errors themselves sometimes spurred new inquiry. When scholars discovered contradictions or anomalies in manuscripts, these became starting points for deeper research, uncovering layers of cultural, religious, or political history. Moreover, the very existence of scribal errors highlights the importance of critical thinking and skepticism when studying historical documents. Accepting texts at face value ignores the complex journey each document has undergone. By understanding how texts were transmitted, we can better appreciate the nuances and uncertainties of history. In a broader cultural sense, Scribal errors contributed unintentionally to the evolution of languages, literary traditions, and even ideas. Small mistakes introduced new words or phrases that entered common usage. Variants in text sometimes inspired new interpretations or creative retellings. Reflecting on the impact of scribal errors also invites us to consider our modern relationship with information. In an age of digital media and instant communication, how do errors, misquotes, or misinformation compare to ancient scribal mistakes? Are we better or worse at preserving accuracy? What lessons can we learn from those who labored over parchment centuries ago? Lastly, the legacy of scribal errors reminds us that history itself is an ongoing, imperfect process. It is shaped not just by grand events and figures, but by the mundane, repetitive, and often boring acts of people copying, preserving, and sometimes altering the record. These acts, flawed though they may be, have allowed the survival of culture, ideas, and identity across millennia. So next time you hold a book, scroll through a digital archive, or listen to a story passed down, remember the long chain of human effort behind it. The scribes, with all their imperfections, are the unsung heroes of history's survival. Yet, one final question remains. In a world where the transmission of knowledge is increasingly digital and instantaneous, how will future generations grapple with errors, both accidental and deliberate, in the records we leave behind? Imagine Europe in the Middle Ages, a continent wrapped in chilly fogs, muddy roads, and damp castles. Food was often bland, dominated by coarse grains, salted meats, and root vegetables grown in small plots around villages and monasteries. Yet, amidst this otherwise monotonous diet, a handful of exotic spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were coveted treasures, worth more than gold in some places. But why were these spices so precious? And how did a handful of dried plants, often ground to a powder, become central to medieval economics, politics, and even daily survival strategies? The story begins far from Europe, in the tropical climates of Asia, places like India, Sri Lanka, and the Spice Islands, modern Indonesia. These regions naturally produced aromatic spices, long used in their native cultures for flavoring, medicine, and religious rituals. But to the European palate of the Middle Ages, spices were exotic marvels, almost magical in their ability to transform food, mask unpleasant tastes, and even convey status. At the time, preserving food was a challenge. Without refrigeration, much of what was eaten was salted, smoked, or pickled. Spices served multiple practical purposes. They helped to mask the taste of food that might be slightly spoiled or oversalted. They were also believed to have health benefits, such as aiding digestion or warding off illness, ideas that came from ancient medical texts translated from Arabic and Greek. However, the actual journey of spices from Asian tropics to European tables was a long, expensive, and complex process, a chain of trade routes stretching thousands of miles, involving many different cultures, languages, and political entities. The first major leg of the spice trade was the Silk Road, an ancient network of overland routes connecting China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Caravans of camels, horses, and donkeys transported spices alongside silk, precious stones, and other goods. But these routes were slow and perilous, crossing deserts, mountains, and politically unstable regions. Another vital route was maritime, through the Indian Ocean, controlled by Arab, Persian, Indian, and later Southeast Asian traders. From ports in India and the Indonesian archipelago, spices traveled by ship to the Middle Eastern ports like Aden and Alexandria. From there, goods moved to Mediterranean markets, especially Venice, which became a hub for the European spice trade. Venice's merchants grew wealthy and powerful by controlling the import and distribution of spices. They sold these precious goods to nobles, monarchs, and wealthy merchants across Europe. The price of spices was astronomical. A pound of pepper, for example, could cost several times the average daily wage of a laborer. Because of their value, spices were often used as currency or gifts in political alliances and royal courts. They appeared in documents and wills, marking their importance in society. Spices were also the subject of intense competition, smuggling, and even piracy. Despite their value, the spice trade was incredibly boring in many respects. Most of the work involved tedious, repetitive tasks, packing spices in sacks or chests, navigating slow ships across dangerous seas, and enduring long waits at ports. Merchants had to deal with customs duties, language barriers, and the constant threat of robbery or war. Moreover, spices were fragile and perishable. They had to be carefully stored to preserve their flavor and aroma, which meant that transport conditions were critical. Merchants had to master the art of timing, storage, and negotiation to keep their precious cargo intact and profitable. For Breyer, ordinary people, spices were often unattainable luxury items. But for the elite, spices were essential symbols of refinement and wealth. Nobles might sprinkle cinnamon on their food or flavor wine with cloves to display their status. Spices also played roles in medicine, cosmetics, and religious ceremonies. The church itself used spices in anointing oils and incense, linking these exotic substances to spiritual and ritual significance. The demand for spices helped spur European exploration. When overland and traditional sea routes became blocked or too expensive, such as during the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, European powers like Portugal and Spain sought new sea routes to Asia. This drive directly contributed to the Age of Discovery, leading to voyages by Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. Thus, the mundane, often overlooked trade in dried plants shaped the course of global history. But this leads us to wonder, how did this long, laborious, and expensive chain of spice trade influence not only economies and exploration, but also daily life and social structures in medieval Europe? And what surprises might lurk in the boring details of this global commerce? By the time spices reached European ports, they had already passed through dozens of hands and traveled thousands of miles. But their journey didn't end there. Now came the delicate process of distribution, pricing, and consumption, tasks, handled by a specialized class of people whose livelihoods depended on the minute, boring mechanics of trade. In this section, we will explore the world of spice merchants, trade guilds, accounting ledgers, shipping manifests, and the quiet rhythms of medieval markets. Let's begin in Venice, often called the Gateway of Spices in Europe. Here, ships from Alexandria and Constantinople would unload their precious cargo into vast storehouses near the Rialto Bridge. The Venetian Republic tightly controlled this trade, taxing imports, regulating prices, and granting licenses to certain families and guilds. Merchants would bid on lots of cinnamon, nutmeg, or pepper, keeping detailed records of their transactions. These records, written in Latin or early Italian dialects, were incredibly specific and sometimes astonishingly tedious. A typical entry might read, purchased, 3 sacks black pepper, weight 120 libra, origin, Calicut, via Alexandria, condition, dry, aromatic, no mold, resale plan, distribute to Florence, Milan, Bruges, and Ghent. Price paid, 40 florins per sack. To a modern reader, this sounds dry, but each line captures an intersection of geography, economy, and human judgment. It also reveals how structured and systematized spice trade had become by the High Middle Ages. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were the main hubs in Italy, but cities further inland, like Nuremberg, Bruges, and Paris, also played roles as redistribution points. In Bruges, for instance, spice stalls lined the market squares, often adjacent to cloth sellers and moneylenders. A merchant might travel weeks by cart to sell his stock, dealing with tolls, robbers, and unpredictable weather. Merchants employed factors, agents who represented their interests in foreign markets. These factors had to know not only the spices themselves, but also local prices, customs regulations, and which inns and warehouses were least likely to cheat them. They lived lives full of waiting for buyers, for ships, for permission to sell. 1. Of the strangest elements of the medieval spice trade was the way it blended high risk with extreme tedium. Ships could be lost to storms or pirates. Entire cargoes could spoil if not ventilated properly. Yet the day-to-day involved long hours spent measuring peppercorns, calculating conversions between currencies, or haggling over transport fees. Much of this was governed by guilds, which regulated who could sell what, where, and at what price. These guilds also enforced standards, such as ensuring that spices weren't adulterated. A dishonest seller might mix powdered bark into ground cinnamon or stretch saffron with marigold petals. Inspections were frequent, fines steep, and reputations fragile. Despite all this control, spice fraud remained common. Pepper could be soaked in oil to increase its weight. Nutmeg might be dried too fast and lose its essential oils. As such, expertise in judging spices, their aroma, texture, and density, became a valued skill, passed down within merchant families. The other side of this trade, of course, was consumption. Spices flowed primarily to the upper classes. In England, for example, court kitchens during the 14th and 15th centuries used generous amounts of pepper, ginger, and saffron in recipes. A single banquet might feature spiced pies, clove-studded meats, and wine mulled with cinnamon and cardamom. But even among the rich, spice usage varied. French nobles favored heavy spice blends, while Italian aristocrats used them more sparingly. In Germany, gingerbread became a staple of festive seasons, combining exotic spices with local honey and flour. For the poor, spices were mostly out of reach. They might encounter traces of them in communal meals during religious festivals or in medicinal concoctions at monasteries. Apothecaries sold small packets of spice for use in salves or teas, often alongside herbs and dried flowers. Monasteries and early hospitals recorded their spice usage in detailed inventories. One 13th century French monastery listed its annual use of spices as follows: pepper, 4 pounds, cinnamon, 2 pounds, ginger, 1 pound, cloves, 6 ounces, for use in meals, teas, and sacred oils. These entries show how thoroughly spices had entered daily institutional life, even in religious settings. They were prized not only for taste, but for symbolic purity and medicinal strength. Back in the markets, pricing was volatile. A bad monsoon in India or a blockade in Alexandria could send European prices soaring. Savvy merchants followed political news closely, knowing that a war in the Levant or a dispute among sultans could mean profit or disaster. By the 15th century, some cities like Lisbon and Seville were becoming new spice centers, challenging Venetian dominance. Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, eventually reaching India, would upend centuries of Middle Eastern and Venetian control. But before that shift, the machinery of spice trade moved with quiet, relentless precision. It's easy to romanticize this global trade, sailing ships, distant islands, exotic goods. But the truth is, it was built on ledgers, crates, damp, warehouses, mold, sweat, and boredom. Like much of history, it thrived not on drama, but on repetition, routine, and risk managed with paperwork. And yet, even in its most bureaucratic form, the spice trade shaped the medieval world, fueling exploration, enriching cities, and changing how people thought about food, medicine, and wealth. It's in the fine print of shipping manifests and market inventories that we find the real heartbeat of medieval commerce. Still, one has to ask, as Europe's thirst for spices grew and its merchants grew bolder, what consequences awaited when new sea routes finally bypassed the old overland networks? What would happen to the cities, markets, and people whose lives revolved around this delicate balance? As the 15th century drew to a close, the familiar world of the medieval spice trade was on the verge of upheaval. For centuries, Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants had formed a network that funneled spices into the hands of European buyers, mostly through Venice and other Mediterranean cities. But this slow, expensive process depended on fragile political alliances and numerous intermediaries. The rising cost of spices and the persistent European desire to control the trade directly began to force a new and more aggressive approach: find the source, cut out the middlemen. It was this simple, boring economic logic that helped spark the so-called Age of Exploration. Though it would later be romanticized as a golden age of discovery, the motivations were deeply practical and commercial. European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, began funding voyages to chart new maritime routes to the east. They weren't chasing dreams. They were chasing pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. The first major breakthrough came with Vasco da Gama, who in 1498 successfully sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut, now Kozhikode, on the southwest coast of India. There, he found not only a flourishing trade in spices, but also a well-established network of Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese merchants. His arrival wasn't particularly welcome, but it marked a turning point. Europeans had, for the first time, reached the spice-producing regions by sea. Da Gama's journey had massive consequences. Suddenly, Portugal could negotiate directly with Indian spice producers and ports. Over the next few decades, the Portuguese established fortified outposts along the Indian coast and seized key cities such as Goa. They used both diplomacy and violence to wedge themselves into the spice trade. Cannons on caravels spoke louder than coin. Back in Europe, the effect was immediate. The price of spices dropped, at least initially, and Lisbon quickly rose as a rival to Venice. By the early 1500s, Portuguese ships were returning to Europe with hundreds of tons of pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. These were no longer dainty luxury goods carried on camelback across the desert. They now arrived in vast, moldy barrels stacked in the holds of ships, measured in tons rather than sacks. This increase in volume didn't necessarily mean better quality. Much of the spice lost potency during the long, damp voyage. But it did mean that the social status of spices began to shift. As they became more accessible to Europe's rising middle classes, spices lost some of their elite mystique and became more integrated into everyday cooking, especially in urban areas. However, the control of spice-producing regions would soon become a central objective of European colonial powers. The Portuguese were followed by the Dutch, who in the early 17th century established the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and began an aggressive campaign to dominate the trade. They targeted the so-called Spice Islands, the Moluccas, in modern-day Indonesia, where nutmeg and cloves were grown. The Dutch imposed brutal monopolies. They burned surplus crops to keep prices high, forcibly relocated populations, and eliminated competing traders. On the Banda Islands, the Dutch massacred or enslaved much of the native population in order to control nutmeg production. It was the ugly underbelly of what had once been a slow, merchant-driven trade. Monopoly capitalism enforced by military conquest. Spices, which had once trickled into Europe through merchant guilds and careful port negotiations, now flowed through. The apparatus of colonial empires. Ships flew national flags, carried chartered company seals, and often traveled with soldiers or mercenaries. The language of trade turned into the language of colonial administration. Inventories became censuses. Ports became garrisons. For the old spice routes and the Silk Road, the Red Sea ports, and overland caravans, this shift was catastrophic. Cities like Alexandria, Aleppo, and Constantinople saw their roles diminish. Venice, long the queen of the European spice trade, gradually lost its economic dominance to Atlantic powers. The dusty warehouses by the Rialto Bridge stood quieter each year, but while the grand structure of the spice trade was changing, its effects on daily life remained steady. In kitchens across Europe, cookbooks from the 16th and 17th centuries show continued use of exotic spices, though the recipes became more standardized. Ground pepper and cinnamon became staples in middle-class households, especially in urban centers like Amsterdam and London. Medicinal use continued as well. Apothecaries in Europe still mixed clove oil for toothaches and saffron for depression. Though early scientific medicine would eventually overtake herbal traditions, the belief in the health benefits of spices persisted into the Enlightenment. One often overlooked consequence of the spice trade's expansion was its influence on agriculture and botany. As European colonial powers took control of tropical regions, they began cultivating spice crops in new areas. Nutmeg trees were transplanted to Mauritius and later the Caribbean. Cinnamon was cultivated in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, under both Portuguese and Dutch rule. The classification, transport, and planting of spice-bearing plants became part of imperial science. Botanical gardens in Europe, such as the Hortus Botanicus in Leiden, collected specimens and trained colonial administrators in their cultivation. This marked the beginning of globalized agricultural science, born not from academic curiosity, but from the desire to control boring yet valuable goods. The social meanings of spices also shifted. They no longer solely represented exotic wealth. They became part of festive traditions. Gingerbread at Christmas, mulled wine in winter, or hot cross buns at Easter. Over time, the sense of their foreignness diminished. By the 18th century, spices were as much a part of domestic life as sugar or tea, also colonial commodities. By then, however, many of the initial players in the spice trade had faded from memory. The anonymous merchants of Cairo, the ledger keepers of Bruges, the caravan leaders of Persia. Their roles had been eclipsed by empires, navies, and companies with corporate charters. What began as a slow, meticulous, and sometimes dull commercial tradition had become a global system of exploitation and wealth transfer. And yet, at its heart, the spice trade remained tied to something deeply ordinary: the human desire to make food taste better, to feel healthier, to add pleasure to life. Across centuries and continents, it was this simple desire that moved ships, armies, and economies. In reflecting on the long, dusty road of spice, from Indonesian groves to Venetian markets, and finally into your kitchen cabinet, we're left to ask, what other luxuries in our lives, once precious and world-altering, have become so ordinary that we no longer see their history? What else sits quietly in our pantries, carrying the legacy of forgotten labor and global change? By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the Roman Empire had reached its territorial peak. Stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia and from the Rhine to North Africa, it had become a logistical nightmare to govern. Among the most pressing and least glamorous of concerns was this: how to keep the city of Rome, and later, other major urban centers, fed bread remained central to this concern. Roman citizens were entitled to subsidized or free grain under the annona, a policy so integral to civic life that emperors who failed to maintain it risked uprisings. At the heart of this were the bakers, who had to maintain uninterrupted production, regardless of harvest failures, supply chain disruptions, or rising costs. But the more the empire grew, the harder this became. To begin with, Rome's grain supply lines were vast and vulnerable. Grain was shipped across the Mediterranean in massive vessels, navis honorariae, some capable of carrying 300 tons of cargo. These ships were heavily reliant on seasonal winds, which meant that stormy seas or poor weather could delay shipments by weeks or months. A few bad months could mean bakeries ran out of flour, and then the whole city would suffer. Even in good years, the supply was barely adequate. Rome required hundreds of thousands of tons of grain annually. Much of this came from Egypt and North Africa, especially from cities like Carthage and Alexandria, which effectively became the empire's breadbasket. To ensure consistency, the Roman state developed one of history's first real logistics bureaucracies, with officials known as the Praefectus Annoni overseeing supply, shipment, storage, and distribution. The baker, however, remained the end point in this long chain. When grain was late or spoiled, it was the baker who was blamed. Accused of hoarding, price gouging, or cheating, bakers faced fines, public shaming, and worse. Some records indicate that failing to meet quotas, especially during times of famine, could result in beatings or imprisonment. And famine was not an abstract threat. Grain harvests were highly susceptible to weather, pests, war, or even poor planning. In lean years, the price of grain spiked, and bread became a political issue. If a baker was given less flour but told to make the same number of loaves at the same price, he faced a simple but painful decision: lose money or risk punishment. There was no winning. Inflation compounded the problem. By the late 3rd century, the Roman economy was in crisis. Coinage had been debased. Emperors like Diocletian issued more and more money with less and less silver. Prices soared, and the government issued price edicts to try to curb inflation. Diocletian's famous edict on maximum prices in 301 CE listed the acceptable cost of a loaf of bread, the price of a modius, a Roman grain measure, and the wages of a baker. It was one of the earliest examples of price control, and it mostly failed. Why? Because the state was demanding fixed prices without guaranteeing fixed inputs. If the cost of firewood, flour, or labor increased, but the price of bread remained capped, bakers were forced to choose between financial ruin or criminality. The edict, though widely publicized, was often ignored or circumvented. Violations were punished harshly: confiscation, flogging, even execution, but enforcement was inconsistent. Markets still fluctuated, and the black market for grain flourished. Bakers learned to operate in a gray zone: enough compliance to survive, enough evasion to remain solvent. This tension between state control and economic survival shaped the baker's daily life. A bakery, or pistrina, in the 3rd century was a place of discipline and oversight. Flour was weighed and recorded, loaves were counted, deliveries were tracked. A baker couldn't simply bake more or less based on whim. He was tied to quotas, to contracts with the state, and to obligations to private clients. The workforce in Roman bakeries had also evolved. Many establishments now operated like miniature factories. Slave labor remained common, but freedmen and poor citizens worked alongside them. Tasks were divided. Millers crushed the grain, kneaders mixed the dough, stampers imprinted official seals, firemen managed the ovens. Supervisors watched over it all, with the master baker, often a freedman himself, recording output in wax tablets. Archaeological discoveries, especially in Pompeii, give us vivid details. Some bakeries had designated rooms for each task. Ash-preserved millstones and kneading tables still sit in place. One bakery had 81 loaves fossilized in its oven, carbonized remnants of a day's work, frozen by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Interestingly, Roman law recognized the importance of bakers to such an extent that their sons were often bound to the profession. In late antiquity, under the rule of Constantine and his successors, bakers were made part of a hereditary guild, Collegia Pistorum, whose members could not freely leave or pass on their business without approval. This was a defensive measure by the state. If people abandoned baking in favor of more profitable trades, the city would starve. Some bakers resisted. There are records of bakers fleeing their posts or bribing officials to escape their hereditary duty. In response, laws were passed to confiscate their property, return them to their original post, and even punish family members. In one law issued by Emperor Theodosius, a runaway baker could be physically chained to his bakery, a literal representation of the state's desperation to control its food supply. By the 4th century, the strain had become unbearable. Rome's population had begun to decline, but the imperial system still tried to operate as though it was feeding 1 million citizens. Corruption crept into every level of the grain and bread economy. State grain was siphoned off for private sale. Officials took bribes to look the other way. Bakers faced increasing pressure with decreasing resources. In the provinces, the picture was mixed. Cities like Constantinople adopted similar systems of grain dole and regulated baking, while smaller, towns often relied on local bakeries with less oversight. But the ideals of uniformity and control remained. Bread by this point wasn't just food. It was a symbol of imperial care. To let it fail was to let Rome itself fail. Despite all this, bread consumption remained remarkably high. In working class, Roman households, bread constituted up to 70% of daily caloric intake. Loaves were eaten with olive oil, dipped in wine, or soaked in broth. Leftover bread was crumbled into porridge. Even hardened crusts were used in household cleaning or as feed for animals. Culturally, bread took on an almost mythic role. It appeared in funerary art, in poetry, and satire. A well-run bakery was considered an asset to any neighborhood, and the baker's stamp became a badge of both civic duty and personal pride. And yet, by the late 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire fractured and fell, the bakery, like so many other Roman institutions, began to fade from view. The collegia disintegrated. Grain imports collapsed. The great city of Rome, once fed by an invisible army of bakers and bureaucrats, shrank into a shadow of its former self. What happened to those last bakers? Did they simply stop working, their ovens cold and quiet? Or did they adapt, turning from state contractors into private vendors, kneading dough for whatever customers remained? And more curiously, how did this tightly regulated, deeply bureaucratic world of flour and fire give way to the more artisanal, local baking cultures of the medieval world? As the 5th century wore on, the Western Roman Empire entered its final act. Political instability, economic decline, and external invasions gradually eroded the tightly knit bureaucratic systems that had kept Rome fed for centuries. Among the casualties of this long, slow collapse were the bakers, or more precisely, the institutional structures that had controlled them for generations. By 476 CE, when the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed, much of the old urban order had already crumbled. Rome, once a metropolis of over 1 million people, had shrunk dramatically. Estimates suggest that by the early 6th century, its population may have fallen below 100,000. The annona system, the intricate web of grain acquisition, shipment, milling, and distribution, was in shambles. With it went the rigid system of quotas, hereditary bakery guilds, and state-imposed pricing. And yet, bread did not disappear. In the centuries that followed, a quieter kind of baking endured, smaller, localized, and no longer bound to imperial bureaucracy. Freed from their forced roles as arms of the state, bakers returned to being tradesmen, participating in community life in much the same way blacksmiths or cobblers did. But the memory of the Roman bakery system lingered, and in many places, traces of it shaped the emerging economies and cultures of early medieval Europe. Some of these traces were practical. Many of the technical innovations developed in Roman bakeries survived long after the empire's collapse. The rotary quern, a kind of hand mill used to grind flour, remained in common use. The donkey-powered grain mills, perfected in Roman cities and found in archaeological sites like Pompeii, inspired similar designs in monasteries and manorial estates. Even the layout of Roman pistrina influenced later medieval bakehouses. More subtle were the organizational echoes. In some cities, especially in Italy and southern Gaul, local guilds of bakers re-emerged in the early Middle Ages, this time as voluntary associations. They set their own rules, determined fair pricing, and helped regulate training and apprenticeship, not because the state demanded it, but because the craft itself needed structure. Churches and monasteries played a key role in this transition. With the Roman state gone, the church became the new center of civic authority, and it too required bread, both for daily sustenance and for religious ritual. The baking of the Eucharistic host became a holy duty. Monasteries developed their own mills, ovens, and grain storage systems. Some monks, in effect, became the new bakers of Europe, grinding flour, kneading dough, and baking loaves not for profit, but as part of spiritual labor. Interestingly, as early medieval society developed, bread once again took on symbolic importance, this time in a Christian context. Where once the Roman emperor had been the guarantor of grain and bread, now Christ was the bread of life, and the host became central to worship. The daily bread that once symbolized the emperor's care now symbolized divine providence. But despite these cultural shifts, daily life for many bakers remained rooted in old habits. In towns that had survived the empire's fall, bakers continued to serve their communities with loaves not too different from those made in ancient Rome. Inscriptions, graffiti, and early medieval recipes show remarkable continuity in ingredients. Wheat flour, water, salt, sometimes honey, oil, or cheese. Round loaves stamped with patterns persisted into the Carolingian period. One of the most enduring legacies was the practice of stamping loaves with identifying marks, a Roman tradition meant to ensure accountability and prevent fraud. Early medieval guilds continued this, not only to indicate origin, but also to protect reputations in a world where a bad loaf could ruin a baker's name. This local focus, though smaller in scale, may have been a blessing in disguise. Freed from the demands of the imperial state, with its impossible quotas and inflationary pressures, bakers could once again control their labor, their prices, and their materials. Many likely bartered their goods, exchanging bread for eggs, cloth, or firewood. The economy shrank, but it also simplified. Still, challenges remained. War and famine continued to disrupt grain supplies. In some regions, especially Northern Europe, bread became coarser and more variable, made from mixed grains like barley, rye, or spelt. The finely sifted wheat flour that Roman elites had once favored became a luxury. For many, bread became darker, denser, and more rustic. Technological progress slowed. The large-scale oven designs of the Roman world, with their vaulted brick domes and regulated heat, gave way to simpler, home-based hearth baking or shared village ovens. The urban bakery, once a complex enterprise, of machines, slaves, and state contracts, now resembled a modest workshop or kitchen. Despite this, the knowledge of Roman baking never entirely vanished. In fact, many early modern writers looked back to Roman manuals, like those of Cato the Elder or Pliny the Elder, to rediscover lost techniques. By the Renaissance, scholars studying ancient texts helped revive interest in traditional Roman loaves, flour refinement, and baking schedules. But perhaps the most curious legacy of Roman bakers was not in flour or ovens, but in the administrative and legal ideas they left behind. Consider this: the concept of regulating food quality and price, of holding producers accountable to the public, of using the state to manage basic needs. These were Roman innovations. The idea that bread was not just a product but a civic responsibility laid the groundwork for later food regulation systems across Europe. In medieval Paris, for example, bakers were inspected by local authorities and required to post prices publicly, a direct echo of Roman price edicts. In England, by the 13th century, the assize of bread and ale codified rules for baking quality and fair pricing. In both cases, the underlying idea was familiar: bread matters, and those who bake it serve the community. Even in the modern world, when governments intervene in food markets, maintain grain reserves, or subsidize bread for the poor, they are walking in Roman footsteps. The phrase bread and circuses, often used to criticize governments for appeasing people with food and entertainment, originated in satire, but reflects a real Roman belief that feeding people was part of governing them. So, what does this long history tell us? It tells us that the baker's life was never truly simple. Whether chained to quotas under Diocletian or kneading dough in a quiet monastery, bakers have always stood at the intersection of necessity and power. They turned flour into sustenance, but they also turned civic anxiety into something edible. They fed revolutions and rituals, soldiers and senators, the devout and the indifferent. Their legacy is not one of dramatic battles or famous speeches. It is measured in loaves, in hours before dawn, in ovens fired with wood, and in flour carried on backs or carted through alleys. It is, in short, a history of endurance, warm, dusty, and mostly forgotten. The Roman Empire fell, but bread endured. It rose and browned and crackled in ovens long after emperors turned to dust. And in that simple fact, the persistence of baking, lies a quiet kind of human resilience. But what might today's mass-produced bread, with its preservatives and plastic wrap, have in common with the coarse, state-stamped loaves of ancient Rome? Has something essential been lost or simply transformed?